Welcome back to the Classic and Current Gaming Podcast, a weekly podcast where we look at the history and development of video games across all of time. I'm your host, RxDude22, and this is the start of Season 2, where we're going to look at all the games in the Retro Gaming League on Facebook for Season 7. If you're not familiar with the Retro Gaming League, check it out on Facebook, do a search for it. It's a friendly competition where pages come together and compete against each other each week in various retro games. This week's game is Wave Race 64 for the Nintendo 64. This is also episode 11 of the podcast. Let's go right into it. Wave Race 64 is a 1996 racing video game developed and published by Nintendo for the Nintendo 64. Gameplay involves the player racing on a personal watercraft on a variety of courses while successfully maneuvering the vehicle around various buoys. A multiplayer mode where two players can compete against each other on a chosen course is also included. The game supports the controller pack, which allows players to transfer save data from one game cartridge to another. Originally referred to as F-Zero on Water, the game was intended to feature high-speed boats with transforming capabilities, but these were ultimately replaced with jet skis as producer Shigeru Miyamoto felt that the game would not be differentiated enough from other titles on other systems. Wave Race 64 received acclaim from critics who praised the game's satisfying controls and dynamic, watery environments. The game is credited with helping Nintendo effectively make its paradigmatic leap from the 16-bit 2D graphics of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System to the Nintendo 64's 3D capabilities. It was re-released for the Wii and Wii U's Virtual Console in 2007 and 2016 respectively, and on Nintendo Switch Online and expansion pack into 2022. A sequel, Wave Race Blue Storm, was released for the GameCube in 2001. Gameplay. Wave Race 64 is a racing video game in which players race on a personal watercraft in different weather conditions and on a variety of courses. The game features 3 single-player modes, Championship, Time Trials, and Stunt Mode, as well as multiplayer mode for competitive play. In the Championship mode, the player must race opponents through a series of courses and win the first place. Up to 4 levels of difficulty can be chosen: Normal, Hard, Expert, and Reverse, the latter being Expert with the tracks oriented backwards. Hard, Expert, and Reverse must be unlocked by completing an earlier difficulty. The difficulty also determines the number of courses played: 6 in Normal, 7 in Hard, and 8 in Expert Reverse. When the player completes a course, points are awarded based on the rank they finished. If the required quantity is not met, the player will be disqualified and the game will be over. While racing opponents, the player must successfully maneuver the jet ski around various buoys. There are 2 types of buoys: red-colored, which must be passed on the right side, and yellow buoys, which must be passed on the left side. Each time a buoy is correctly passed, a power arrow in the game's HUD will light, allowing the player's watercraft to gain speed. Up to 5 power arrows can be lit in order to obtain maximum power. Therefore, maintaining this process will allow the player to maintain a high speed. Failure to correctly pass a single buoy will result in the loss of all the player's accumulated power, though the power arrows can be lit again one by one, and missing 5 buoys over the course of a race will result in disqualification. Leaving the course area limited by pink buoys for more than 5 seconds will also result in disqualification. In time trials, the player can freely race on a course to perform the best times, which are recorded in the game's data. In the stunt mode, the player must earn points by executing stunts and passing through rings. The points depend on how many rings the player passes through without missing, as well as the class of the stunt that has been performed. The multiplayer mode uses a horizontal split screen and allows 2 players to compete against each other on a chosen course. Only the courses that have been unlocked in Championship mode can be played in the time trial, stunt, and multiplayer modes. The game offers 4 personalized racers for players to select from, each having their own strengths and weaknesses. A Nintendo 64 controller pack can be used to transfer save data from one game cartridge to another. Development and release. Wave Race 64 was developed by Nintendo EAD and produced by Shigeru Miyamoto as one of the first Nintendo 64 games. Development of the game was led by Shinya Takahashi, who had been working with Nintendo since 1989. Takahashi, along with Yoshiaki Kozumi, who worked with Miyamoto on Super Mario 64, are credited for helping the company effectively make its paradigmatic leap from the 16-bit 2D graphics of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System to the Nintendo 64's 3D capabilities. Since the game's engineers only had experience with 2D graphics of earlier Nintendo consoles, Takahashi had to guide them through the first stages of development. While experimenting with the Nintendo 64 Silicon graphics technology, one of the programmers created a tech demo that served as an example of the game's wave programming. The tech demo caught the attention of Miyamoto, and soon the team began to figure out a way to create something fun from it. Originally, the game was referred to as F-Zero on Water, and would feature high-speed boats as shown in footage from the 1995 Nintendo Shishokyoko Show. The boats were planned to have transforming capabilities, allowing players to switch from a stable catamaran-style form to a more streamlined canoe-style version. However, the boats were ultimately replaced with jet skis at the suggestion of Rare's Tim Stamper. Miyamoto explained, "The boats look pretty good at the show, but I don't think the Wave Race 64 would be unique from similar games on other systems if we use boats. Jet skis can show many maneuvers that work well in the realistic water of Wave Race 64. The game uses Nintendo 64's Alpha Budding feature to make the water simultaneously transparent and reflective." Wave Race 64 was promoted with a marketing campaign that cost $4 million. It was first released in Japan in September of 1996 on an 8-megabyte cartridge. In the United States, Wave Race 64 was released as the third Nintendo 64 game on November 4, 1996, featuring voice changes and renamed levels. It was the first racing game developed by the Nintendo 64, and the first to use Nintendo 64's hardware capabilities to create a believable and engaging water environment unmatched by previous games. In the United Kingdom, the game was released in April 1997, shortly after the launch of Nintendo 64. Like Super Mario 64, Wave Race 64 was reissued in Japan in July of 1997 as Wave Race 64 Shindo Pack Thai version. Wave Race 64 Rumble Pack compatible version. This version takes advantage of the Nintendo 64 Rumble Pack and adds ghost functions to the game's time trial mode, in the form of a dolphin that races against the player and represents the previous best time on the course. Some music and sound effects were altered as well. Reception. Wave Race 64 was a critical and commercial success, selling more than 154,000 units in Japan by December 1996 and more than 1 million units in the United States by December 1997. As of December 2007, the game had sold 1.95 million copies in the United States. At the time of its release, some reviewers consider it to be one of the greatest racing games of all time on a home console. GamePro described Wave Race 64 as a phenomenally fun racing game that captivates players with its deep and challenging gameplay, while Next Generation regarded it as one of the first quality titles released for the Nintendo 64, along with Super Mario 64 and Pilotwings 64. Graphically, Wave Race 64 was praised for its fluid animations, realistic physics, clean waters, and textured polygons. IGN's Doug Perry commented that the jet skis in the game provide believable and spectacular experiences. Writing for the Electric Playground, Victor Lucas highlighted the game's distinct environments, saying that each course offers players something to get excited about. He also gave high marks to the game's satisfying sound effects, particularly when players submerged under the waves, but felt the music was shallow. GamePro agreed that describing the music as juvenile and the announcer's voice as irritating. In contrast, All Games' Jonty Davies felt that the game's cheesy and distinctly 80s themed soundtrack combined with the announcer's hyper-excited cries gave the game a light and arcade feel. N64 magazine journalists described Wave Race 64 as one of the deepest racing games they had played, stating that the game's dynamic waves constantly test and retest the player's control and that the buoy system offers tactical decisions about whether to spend time taking a wide corner or dash straight on to catch the leader before it's too late. Similarly, Game Informer remarked that the waves can strike players on every turn and that one mistake can mean the difference between victory and defeat. Edge highly praised the game's believable watery environments and satisfying controls, stating that each of the game's 4 crafts feature different handling characteristics, which is accentuated by the way that interact with the water. Although the magazine criticized the game's lack of courses, noting that most of them can be seen in a day's play, it ultimately concluded that Wave Race 64 is an example of how Nintendo's approach to game design still remains markedly different from almost every other video games company in the world. The controls were generally praised, although Todd Mowat of Electronic Gaming Monthly noted that getting used to them can take some time. Glenn Rubenstein of GameStop also praised the game's controls, stating that the Wave Race 64 makes the best use yet of Nintendo 64 analog stick. Although he highlighted the multiplayer mode for offering a fairly good competition, he criticized its small split-screen play areas for detracting from the drama. Alex Hutala of CVG felt that the game was too short, but admitted that multiplayer and stunt modes give the game longevity. In March 1997, Electronic Gaming Monthly editors named Wave Race 64 their Sports Game of the Year and a runner-up for their Nintendo 64 Game of the Year award behind Super Mario 64, citing the realistic physics and variety of tracks. Legacy. After its release on the Nintendo 64, Wave Race 64 has been included in several top lists. In 1997, Electronic Gaming Monthly ranked the game 68th on its list of 100 best games of all time. In 1999, Next Generation ranked it 20th on a similar list, commenting that Wave Race 64, along with Mario 64, demonstrated more graphical power for the system. IGN editors ranked it 33rd on their 2003 list of top 100 games of all time, and 37th on another list published in 2005. They remarked that Wave Race 64 incorporated water physics into racing unlike any game before it or any since. The simple concept of racing on jet skis was complicated by changing wave patterns, swells, and rising tides, and Nintendo added its trademark deck to broaden and deepen the unique racing. In 2006, Nintendo Power placed Wave Race 64 at 127th in its top 200 games list. In 2009, Official Nintendo Magazine ranked the game 49th on a list of greatest Nintendo games of all time. A sequel, Wave Race Blue Storm, was released in 2001 on GameCube. Wave Race 64 was released in China for the iQue Player console in 2003. A 1-hour demo of the game was also included with the console. On August 6, 2007, the game was released on the Wii's Virtual Console. Unlike Nintendo 64 version, the Virtual Console release does not feature Kawasaki banners due to expired licensing deals. These were replaced by Wii and Nintendo DS advertisements. When the game was released on the Wii U's Virtual Console in 2016, the Kawasaki banners were restored. The game was re-released on the Nintendo Switch Online and Expansion Pack on August 19, 2022, once again with the Kawasaki banners restored. The Virtual Console versions of the game were generally very well received, with reviewers considering the game to be just as much fun as it was on the Nintendo 64. Codemasters producer Guy Wilde cited Wave Race 64 as a key influence in the design of their 1998 racing game Colin McRae Rally. According to Wilde, Wave Race 64 is a fine example of a game with realistic physics and an incredibly well-balanced control system. The game is easy to pick up and play, but it is only after playing it for some time that you start to understand the additional nuances of the controls. Initially, it's just about going left or right, but later you start to use the weight of the rider to fine-tune the movement of the jet ski in the corners and over the waves. I love the fact that this game was easily accessible, but had the greater depth of more hardcore players. This was a key design goal for Colin McRae Rally. All the information here was provided by Wikipedia.
First and got 7 points. Great race.
And that'll bring this episode of the Classic and Current Gaming Podcast to a close. We're on different platforms. If you can't watch us on YouTube, you can listen to us on Spotify or your other favorite podcast listening platforms. We do this each and every week. This is Season 2, and next week we'll be having our second episode of Season 2, and it's going to be Battletoads for the NES, so we look forward to talking to you about that then. It's been RxDude22 from the Classic and Current Gaming Podcast, signing out. Keep on gaming, see you on the next stream, be good to each other, and see you on the next podcast. Have a great week, guys, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.